Peter had stood in a room exactly like this before, surrounded by mourners and the heavy silence of a body that wasn't supposed to move again. Years earlier, he watched Jesus take a little girl by the hand and say, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, arise." Now Peter finds himself in a place called Joppa, and there is another body waiting for him in an upper room. But this time, we aren't talking about the ruler's daughter, because this is a woman in a busy port city who made a living as a seamstress. Luke gives her a title that no other named woman receives in the entire Greek New Testament, and that word is disciple. This isn't just a story about a miracle, but it's a test to see if the life of Jesus is still moving through his church, and if a woman like Tabitha really stood at the center of that story. Joppa sat on the Mediterranean coast as a busy harbor filled with ships, merchants, and travelers moving between different languages. Port cities pull in goods, but they also pull in stories, rumors, and new kinds of faith. And Joppa was exactly that kind of place where Jewish life and Roman pleasure and trade money all mixed together. When Luke introduces Tabitha, he gives us both of her names, calling her Tabitha in Aramaic and Dorcas in the Greek, which both mean gazelle. In a multicultural city like Joppa, that fits her perfectly. And Luke puts that name on a woman whose calling looked very slow and very hidden. Think about it for a second, because her life was about needles and thread and cloth. Grace can look really quiet sometimes. Then Luke says something even more important that changes the whole vibe of the story. In Acts 9:36, he calls her a disciple, using the word mathetria. And this is the only place in the Bible where that exact feminine form is used. Luke could have called her a believer or a servant, but he chose disciple. So Tabitha is not background help in the Jesus movement. Acts 9:36 says she was full of good works and acts of charity, which basically means she just kept doing practical mercy. This wasn't some random kindness she did once in a while, but it was a pattern of life that people could actually depend on. And here's the thing, in the book of Acts, that kind of work is never treated like it's less important than preaching. Her faith shows up in what her hands are doing, and she makes things people can actually wear to stay warm and keep their dignity. For Tabitha, the needle was not separate from her ministry, and the sewing was a real kingdom vocation. Just picture her hands for a second, with the thread and the rough fabric and the long hours. Her discipleship wasn't some abstract idea, but it lived in the labor itself and in the clothes that help people step outside with pride. Here's what I mean. She used ordinary work like it's holy work, and that tells you your daily skills can carry kingdom weight too. That's why her story hit so hard, because in a city built on hard labor and just trying to survive, Tabitha became a source of steady care. There was no spotlight and no stage, just repeated acts of mercy. And then the person holding the whole community together suddenly gets sick. Then things start moving fast because Luke doesn't even spend time stretching out the drama. If you look at Acts 9:37, it just says that in those days she got sick and died. And that's really all there is to it. Those are plain words. But that is usually how death shows up for the people left behind. There isn't a big warning speech or a long goodbye, because one day their hands are busy working and the next they just stop. After she passes, her body is washed and placed in an upper room. And you need to realize that this detail actually matters quite a bit. In the Jewish world back then, people usually moved very quickly toward burial. So when the believers in Joppa washed Tabitha and lay her upstairs instead of heading straight to the grave, the whole situation feels suspended. Acts 9:37 puts it simply by saying they washed her and placed her in an upper room. But that room would have felt different the second they walked in. It was colder and heavier, and the very hands they were washing had spent years clothing other people. But now those hands were perfectly still. You can feel the grief in the air, but there's also this hesitation, almost like the entire room is holding its breath to see what happens next. And this is where the book of Acts starts pressing us on to. See, the early church didn't treat resurrection like it was just some future comfort for after you die. They lived their lives like the age to come had already broken into the present. So when you find yourself in your own upper room moment, when a dream feels shut down or buried or totally done, this story reminds us that resurrection life isn't only for later. God still has a way of bringing his future into dead places right now and downstairs, or maybe just outside that door. The real shape of the lost starts to show. Widows are gathering and they are crying. But this isn't just the normal grief you see from friends at a funeral. This is the deep, gut-wrenching grief of women who know exactly what her absence is going to cost them. Here's the problem we have to understand. In 1st century Joppa, widowhood could put a woman in a very fragile place. First, not every widow was destitute, but many could lose income, protection, and daily stability all at once, which meant survival often depended on family or on a community that chose not to look away. Luke doesn't leave that as a dry history lesson. He makes you feel the weight of it in that room with the wet eyes, the cold air upstairs, and the rough fabric bunched up in shaking hands. These women are standing there wearing the very clothes that Tabitha had made to cover them. So when Luke shows you these widows surrounding Tabitha's deathbed, he's showing you a lot more than just sadness. The proof of what her life meant is right there in their hands. They hold up the tunics and the garments she made while she was still with them. And while that line sounds simple, you have to get this. Those clothes are grief made visible. They are memories you can actually touch, and they serve as evidence for everyone to see. In a world where poor women didn't have any public power, these garments were doing the speaking for them. You can really feel the fear hiding under that moment. With Tabitha gone, these widows are staring at the very real chance of becoming invisible again. Just another group of poor women in a city that was busy with trade and money. Because clothing in that world wasn't like the cheap, throwaway stuff we have today. Fabric had to be made by hand, woven and stitched with a lot of effort. Modern research suggests that making a single standard garment could take a team of 3 weavers nearly a month to finish. A cloak meant you stayed warm, and a tunic meant you had dignity. So Tabitha's sewing wasn't just some decorative hobby, it was economic mercy. And get this, that kind of mercy was building a completely different kind of community right in the middle of the city. Rome ran on status and pressure and survival of the fittest. But Tabitha's labor helped build a counter-imperial community where the people who were exposed weren't left to suffer alone. When Tabitha dies, a fragile support line snaps for everyone involved. This is why the scene feels so much heavier than just one funeral. A disciple is gone, but so is a provider, a maker, and a helper whose daily work held a piece of the church together. The widows know it, the community knows it, and Luke wants to make sure you know it too. So the big question hanging over that upper room isn't just why she died, but why they haven't buried her yet. Somewhere inside all of that grief, hope hasn't fully let go. And at that exact moment, Peter happens to be nearby in the town of Lydda. That detail matters because Peter hasn't just been sitting around teaching. He had just healed a man named Aeneas, and the news of that miracle was already spreading through the region. People were starting to hear that something incredible was happening through Peter's ministry, and they saw it not as magic or a performance, but a visible sign that Jesus was still acting in the world. So when Tabitha dies, the believers in Joppa don't sit around and wait. They send 2 men immediately and urge Peter to come without any delay. That kind of urgency tells you everything you need to know. This wasn't a casual request for someone to come give a little funeral comfort. They moved fast because the loss was massive and because hope was somehow still alive in their hearts. They knew Peter was close. They knew what had just happened in Lydda. And now the big question is hanging in the air. What happens when apostolic authority walks into a room where the need is final? Because what broke in Joppa wasn't just one physical body. An entire network of mercy had just gone down in that one room. And the people sending for Peter might not have known exactly what God would do, but they definitely knew what was at stake. There is the tension of the story. Because by the time Peter climbs those stairs, nobody in that room has the power to fix what's broken. When Peter finally arrives, they bring him upstairs. But before Luke tells you what Peter does, he makes you look at exactly what Peter walks into. He isn't met with a complicated theological argument or some polished professional request. Instead, he is met with a silent and physical testimony from the people there. The widows are standing in the room, still weeping and still holding those garments. And there are no long speeches to be found. There is just the sight of cloth held in grieving hands. In that room, those garments walk almost like witness statements in a court. This tunic kept a person covered. That cloak kept someone warm. And the message was clear. This woman mattered and her work mattered. The clothes were speaking in a way that status and money never could. And this is where the whole question of church authority gets very sharp for us. What is apostolic power actually for? In Joppa, we see that authority gets pushed straight into the place where grief and survival and mercy all met. Peter being called into a room where vulnerable people have just lost the one person whose daily labor kept them going. That changes the entire scene. Because now the miracle, if a miracle actually happens, won't just be some random display of power. It will be power meeting a human need so deep that the entire church can feel the weight of it. And Luke writes this in a way that is meant to stir up some older memories for us too. A dead body in an upper room, a holy man being summoned, and a desperate community waiting for something beyond an ordinary outcome. If you know your scriptures, you can hear the echoes of Elijah and Elisha rising up. God has worked in this exact way before. That's the key to the whole thing. Acts is showing us that there is continuity in what God is doing. Jesus might be gone from our sight, but his work is not gone from the world. His authority is still moving through his witnesses today. So when Peter steps into this upper room, the story is quietly asking us if the life of Jesus is still active in the church. But Peter doesn't rush in to put on a big display or turn the room into a theater for people to watch. Instead, he sends everyone out of the room. And the moment that room empties, everything narrows down to just one apostle, one dead disciple, and one impossible need. Then Peter prays. That detail matters way more than it seems first. Peter kneels down and he starts to pray. And this tells us everything about where his head is at. The authority in this room doesn't start with Peter showing off what he can do, but it starts with him completely depending on God. Before he ever gives a command, he chooses to surrender. And that is exactly how the book of Acts wants you to read this moment. Now the whole room goes completely still. The widows are waiting outside. The body is lying right there in front of him. And the pressure to perform for a crowd is totally gone. It is just Peter, the silence, and this dead disciple whose absence was already tearing a hole through the entire community. This is the part where the story starts to feel like a sequel to what Jesus said. You see, Peter has watched this exact pattern play out before. Back in the house of Jairus, Jesus had put all the mourners outside so he could narrow the room down. He stepped right into the face of death without a hint of panic. And then he spoke to a little girl with words that stayed tucked away in Christian memory. Talitha kumi. It means, little girl, arise. And now Peter is standing in another room years later, while Luke shapes the scene so you can hear the same echo. We should be careful here because Acts doesn't give us Peter's words in Aramaic the way Mark did with Jesus. Luke reports the command in Greek, but many people through the centuries have noticed how close the sound would be if Peter had spoken in Aramaic. Talitha kumi sounds an awful lot like Tabitha kumi. And while it isn't a first quote or some magic formula, it is a beautiful echo. It is close enough to make you stop and realize that Peter is moving in the same stream of power he first saw in his Lord. That changes the whole feel of the scene. Peter isn't trying to replace Jesus or become some revival miracle worker with his own brand of power, but he is acting as a witness through whom the risen Jesus is still working. This is what the book of Acts has been building toward the whole time. Jesus might have ascended to heaven, but his life hasn't been withdrawn from the earth. And his resurrection power is still breaking into rooms, just like this one. Then Peter turns towards the body and he speaks. It is short, direct, and there's no big speech or long build-up around it. Acts 9:40 gives it to you straight when he says, Tabitha, arise.
Tabitha, arise.
And just like that, the impossible starts moving. Luke tells the story with this almost shocking simplicity that hits you hard. Warmth starts returning to the body they all thought was gone forever. And you can almost feel the atmosphere of the room shift as the cold breaks. Death loses its grip right then and there. And there is a real prophetic edge to that moment. God is showing the public exactly what kind of kingdom he is bringing. And he's saying that he sees the overlooked and defends the vulnerable. Tabitha rising is a massive sign of resurrection life breaking into our present world. Think about the scale of this for a second. God didn't choose to raise a powerful ruler here, but instead he raised a simple seamstress. What does that tell you about what the kingdom of God actually values? If that truth lands on you, go ahead and hit like, because it helps this message reach people who need to hear that quiet, messy matters deeply to God. Then Peter reaches out, gives her his hand, and he raises her up. That touch matters so much because he doesn't just leave her there like some exhibit to be stared at. He helps her stand, making the moment personal, gentle, and very real. The same hands that had once followed Jesus through fear and failure are now lifting a restored disciple back into her life. So yes, a physical body has come back to life, but let's be real, something even bigger is rising in the city of Joppa. Mercy is rising, witness is rising, and the church's claim that Jesus is alive is rising right in the middle of a grieving port city. Outside of that closed door, the people who knew exactly what had been lost are about to see that loss completely reversed. And then Peter walks over and opens the door. The widows who had been standing there holding those clothes in their hands now see the very woman who made them standing there alive again. The saints are called in, the widows are called in, and Peter presents her alive to them before anyone else. That order is important because the people who felt the pain of the loss most sharply are the first ones to see what God has done. It is the same upper chamber, the same group of people, and the same city, but everything has changed in an instant. The women who had been holding on to proof of her past mercy are now looking at mercy restored right in front of their eyes. Luke doesn't keep this miracle trapped in a house for private comfort, but Acts 9:42 says it became known throughout all of Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. That line moves fast because in a busy port city like Joppa, news could travel almost as fast as the cargo on the ships. So a well-known disciple in a place like Joppa is raised from the dead. The story isn't going to stay upstairs for very long. This miracle functions as way more than just one family's answered prayer. It actually becomes a city-level witness for everyone to see. The point isn't simply that one woman got her life back, even though that is precious. But the point is that the risen Jesus has made himself visible again through his church. He's doing this in public, in history, and in a place where people are actually watching. That changes things for the entire city. Now, the message about Jesus isn't just floating above daily needs like some abstract idea for religious people to talk about, but it has touched real bodies, households, and survival. When many people in Joppa believe in the Lord, they are responding to a sign that God's power is present right where the need is deepest. True authority enters into grief, kneels down before it speaks, and restores a disciple whose ordinary work held vulnerable people together. That is the kind of church power that Acts wants you to see. And it is life-giving, compassionate, and very concrete. In the book of Acts, that matters because cities like this one become launch points for the gospel. Joppa is one of those special places where the miracle starts upstairs, but it doesn't stay there. It spills out into the streets, and the city starts carrying that story outward to the rest of the world. And that is exactly when Luke adds one more tiny detail. And it's a detail that signals exactly where this mission is going next. Luke tells us that Peter stayed in Joppa for many days with a man named Simon, who was a tanner by trade. At first glance, that might just sound like a bit of travel information or a random detail about where he crashed for the night. But here's the thing, Luke doesn't waste words, especially not in a moment this big. After this massive miracle, Peter doesn't go back to the religious center of the world, but instead, he stays in a house on the very edge of the city. He chooses a place that respectable people usually kept at a distance. And from that house, the whole mission is about to take a massive turn. You see, Joppa was a port city, and ports are always edge places where different worlds collide. This is where strangers step off ships, where you hear 5 different languages at once, and where every boundary you have gets tested. So after a miracle that made the name of Jesus famous across the whole city, Peter doesn't pack his bags and head home. He stays right there in a house that feels like a boundary marker between the old world and the new one. A tanner's job was to work with animal hides, which was messy, physical labor that required a lot of water and plenty of open air. Because of the smell and the nature of the work, these shops were usually pushed to the outskirts, far away from the polished center of town. That's why it makes so much sense that Simon's house was right by the sea, where the salt air and the wind could carry the scent away. This wasn't a place for polished religion or fancy rituals, but it was a place for real work, sweat, and labor right at the margins of society. Now let's be real for a second, because people often rush through this part of the story. Some folks say this proves Peter had already stopped caring about Jewish purity laws, but that's a little too simple. If we look at what scholars are saying lately, the issue with tanners wasn't always about breaking religious rules, but it was more about social disgust. People avoided tanners because they were smelly, dirty, and had low status, which means the real point is that Peter was already moving into uncomfortable spaces. He was choosing to stay close to the kind of work and the kind of people that important society would rather ignore. This isn't just a footnote in the Bible. It's actually a huge cliffhanger. Peter has just crossed one threshold in an upper room with Tabitha, and now Luke leaves him sleeping at the door of another one. It's almost like Luke placed this detail right after Tabitha's resurrection on purpose to show us something. A woman known for her mercy was just brought back to life in a mixed up coastal city, and now faith is spreading like wildfire through Joppa. Peter isn't just waiting there by the sea. And from that tanner's house, the book of Acts is about to explode into his biggest turning point yet. So here's the deal. Joppa isn't just a place where a miracle happened. It's a hinge city. The mercy Peter showed in that upper room is leading directly into a mission that crosses every major boundary. Think about the order of how this happens, because it's not an accident. First, God's power touches a woman who spent her life saving the vulnerable. Then the news fills a busy port city, and then Peter waits at the edge of the water in the home of a man who works with dead animals. That changes how we read Tabitha's story entirely, because her life isn't just a side story tucked between bigger events. Her restored life stands right at the moment before the church steps across into one of the biggest lines in history. It shows us that mercy and mission are tied together, and you really can't have one without the other. And that's still the pattern for us today, right? God forms a people whose authority is seen first in how they treat the weak and the lonely. And then he sends those same people across boundaries they would have probably preferred to keep in place. So what does Tabitha's life actually mean for us today? Especially since most of us aren't apostles and we aren't standing over people telling them to rise from the dead. It means the church needs to stop acting like quiet mercy is a small thing. Think about it. The only woman in the whole New Testament explicitly called a disciple is remembered for her practical generosity. She didn't have a platform, she didn't have a title, and she wasn't looking for a spectacle. She just made things that people actually needed, and heaven put its full weight behind that kind of life. We really need to rethink what spiritual power looks like in our own lives. In Acts chapter 9, power doesn't compete with compassion, but instead, power is what restores compassion. Jesus honored a woman whose ordinary everyday work held the most vulnerable people in her community together. So here's the deal. Think about what those hands left behind when she was gone. She left clothes on people's backs, dignity for widows, and a church that felt a massive hole in their hearts because she was missing. That is exactly what discipleship looked like in Joppa. And it's what it looks like for us too. Every single one of us has some kind of thread in our hands right now. Whether it's a skill, a paycheck, a kitchen table, or just a phone call, you have time, you have strength, and you have attention. And those are all things God can use to cover somebody else's need. Tabitha didn't have to be famous to matter to the kingdom. She just lived like Jesus was the Lord of her schedule and her resources. That is still the call on our lives today. Because the kingdom of God trains us to practice compassion on purpose. It's about making meals, paying bills, mending what's broken, and noticing the people everyone else walks past. If you want to live a life that carries this kind of kingdom weight, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. We are building a community here around hearing God's voice and living with real purpose in the middle of every grind. I want to hear from you in the comments. What is the thread in your hands right now? What's one practical thing you can do to cover someone else's need this week? If I had to give you one line to sum up this whole story, it's this: a true disciple makes mercy visible. And the reason Jesus still puts his weight behind that kind of life. The story doesn't stop in that upper room, because Peter is already standing in the next boundary. And in the next video, we're going to watch the gospel cross a line that a lot of people thought should stay closed forever. So subscribe and let's keep going.